Okay, let's start. Yeah, some people of you already heard some elements, but I can't avoid to do a little of repetition. But of course, I'll try to give the general overview, and then after each part, I will ask you to react if you think it's useful, if you have questions, doubts, and yeah, and in this way we will split this webinar in 5 parts. One general part on the basics, one part on impact evaluation, one part on process evaluation, and then something on how we bring everything together, and also which reporting tools we have available could be used if helpful. So starting to talk about evaluation, yeah, our context to talk about evaluation is CIVITAS, and we have the large CIVITAS family who was extended some years ago. And initially, it was mainly a family of projects in which cities did demonstrate and test further integrated packages of measure, maybe 15, 20 different measures in a city, and looking to what's really happening in that city. Recently, we added also the very interesting approaches of what we call the RIA project of the Research and Innovation Actions, where we mainly focus on 1 or 2 or 3 measures or a type of measure that can be taken in a city. Now, I already used the word measure, and of course, when we talk about evaluation, first question we have is, what do we want to evaluate? And therefore, in the CIVITAS family, a measure is mainly understood as an initiative that cities can take or regions can take in their urban environment on different levels and of different types. So this can be the very easy one. Some people only think about that, and mainly in the past people did that on new infrastructure, a new service. But it can be also a way of having another organization in the way we work on mobility, and also activities to change awareness, attitude, and things like that. That's what we want to evaluate. Looking to this, of course, we are doing that for many reasons, and I don't think I have to convince you. You're working in this field. Why we evaluate? It's not for ourselves. It's to help others to make better decisions, to optimize what they're doing, maybe to be able to upscale what's happening in the city, to give good messages to other cities, what is the value of measures and what they can learn from this. Now, we see that's important to be very clear on what we evaluate. That's what I already stressed. And we see in many projects, in fact, 2 types of evaluation. And I start with the right part of the slide, where in many projects we wonder also, how good is the project functioning? What are the mechanisms in that project to do what in many cases you have promised to the commission or to others? And there you will check whether a specific work package, for instance, did really fulfill its objectives, whether you really succeeded in reaching the many cities you promised to reach with your message, and things like that. But that's what we call project evaluation. However, the main core, the main focus on what we are interested here is, and that's the core of the CIVITAS 2020 evaluation, is the question, what is the impact of the measures cities are taking? What is the impact of one measure, an integrated package of measure, a whole strategy? And what are the important elements we see when we implement these type of measures? It's important also for others to understand the barriers and the drivers for the implementation. And then, of course, and we come back to that, it's crucial to understand also the interaction with other measures. So this is the focus of also this presentation. Now, the key element, and that's already for a long time, we really bring two approaches together. When measures are implemented, in fact, the most theoretical thing we can do, and that's the most straightforward thing we can do, we see what was the situation before and what was the situation after. Before the CIVITAS measure was not implemented, after it was implemented, things hopefully did change. And that's mainly what we call impact evaluation. And the most simple thing is you do a before measurement, you do an after measurement, and you see what changed. And we try to understand the impact. Now, therefore, we already try to structure the CIVITAS, the possible impacts in what we call the CIVITAS impact categories. And you see them here on the slide. We have what is the impact on the transport system, what is the impact on people, society. This means the citizens, the commuters, how do they change their attitude? What is the impact? And we added that element because this became very important recently, that we also wonder what could be the impact on what we call people governments, how the city is organized, how the region is organized. And taking into account this type of impacts, we see also other impacts on energy usage, which is in fact one of the final goals also Europe has. What is the impact on economy? What is the impact on our urban environment, the livability of our cities, which is in fact the final goal of what is done in many cities. So that's impact evaluation. Just doing that is not sufficient, because in this way, we do not understand in the right way, in the best way, what's really happening when we are implementing these measures. And therefore, we put more and more emphasis on process evaluation, a qualitative way of looking to the implementation of the measures. And there we wonder, what are the barriers and the drivers of to implement that measure? It's more, is it easy to implement that measure? Is it difficult to implement that measure? And on the other hand, we also wonder what specific elements in that measure are important, what specific activities we can add to a measure to make, for instance, the implementation of that measure more easy, but also to increase the impact we want to envisage, we want to reach for that measure. And also, of course, we want to avoid or reduce not wanted impacts, but because a good evaluation is also that aspect. Just a small example here. If a city is constructing a bicycle lane on a corridor in a city, this bicycle lane should be constructed. And in many cases, space is needed for this. So in many cases, we see some barriers to implement that, because maybe this bicycle lane is very interesting for commuters coming by bike to the city center, but the inhabitants living in that corridor are maybe not that interested in a very wide bicycle lane and are more interested in keeping their parking places in front of their houses. So that is a barrier in the implementation. But constructing that bicycle lane with the general idea to have more cyclists maybe, we can do a lot of extra activities. And activities first to make the implementation easier. For instance, to organize discussion groups with the inhabitants of that corridor, to create an acceptance for them that they think, yeah, maybe this bicycle lane is also a good thing for us. But we also have to do, or can do, other campaigns or other initiatives, making a general promotion campaign for cyclists. And that's more an example of increasing the envisaged impact. And then maybe a third element in this could be if, and now I take a slightly different example, if you would take one lane, a car lane on a corridor where there were maybe 2 or 3 lanes to go to the city center, then there is a possible risk of changing also the whole flows of traffic around that corridor. And of course, a good evaluation should also understand what's happening there. So this is also an aspect where some of the extra activities can work on to avoid these negative things. And of course, this last example has also an impact on the impact evaluation. If we want to evaluate the impact, then we don't have to measure only in the corridor some figures, but we also have to look to the area around. It was not that long ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I saw a project where people did really evaluate a corridor and neglected the environment around, and all the negative impacts came in the environment around. So this is not a good example of evaluation. Saying this, I come to a last point why process evaluation is important. And that's a bit a very important element we have to work on when we do a good evaluation. We want to understand the story behind the figures. And therefore also process evaluation is important. If we have a good contact with the stakeholders, with end users and things like and elements like that, this really can help to understand what we see in the impact evaluation. Because if only the evaluation people are doing that, if only a measure leader is doing that, maybe they're really missing important elements. So bringing all this together, this should bring to good findings, conclusions, and lessons learned. And therefore, we have to bring all these elements together. Okay, I think this is a first level and maybe a basic approach in the CIVITAS evaluation work. We tried to convince everybody working in this field to take into account at least these elements. Of course, others can add, and that will be also in the next part of the evaluation, in this presentation, sorry. Now, if there is any reaction already, please do. We try to give you the floor. Jose, there is a question of Jose. I try to give him the floor. Yeah. Jose?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, first, when you're talking about the measures, and you say that it would be interesting to understand the interaction with other measures. Are you thinking about measures within the same project or other measures with other CIVITAS projects?
Yeah, that's important to understand these both type of measures are there. And in fact, yeah, we have to have a clear look to both, because when you have the interaction with other measures as part of the project, then you can draw maybe integrated conclusions in the way these two measures are really working together, because you analyze them both in your project. But on the other hand, we can't neglect everything else that's happening in the city. I'm coming back to that in the next slides, because sometimes, and this can be a negative and a positive thing in your evaluation, because, for instance, if the price of the fuel, I just use that example, is going down, and then maybe this raises the use of the car, and you take a lot of measures to avoid that, then yeah, the final result won't be that positive if that full thing was not there. And so this is also a thing you have to include in your evaluation. And in many cases, you have to do that in a qualitative way because you can't measure everything. But yeah, I think it's an important question you raise.
Oh, okay, thank you. And the second one is related to these two kinds of evaluation that we should do for the CIVITAS. You're talking about impact evaluation, but you in the slide that you're showing right now, it happens before the implementation of the measure. So is this kind of an ex ante and ex post evaluation what you're thinking? Because I
Right.
believe.
Sorry. This is important that you raise this. I have to change this slide.
Thank you.
This,
But it's a bit confusing as it is.
yeah, you're right. I realize now nobody said that to me. Because this is indeed the upper part of the slide is really before and after, just to say what's happening. But of course, impact evaluation, and I'm coming back to that in a minute, but it's a before situation and an after situation. So impact is really after also. And process evaluation is also the whole chain. So yeah, I have to take out that the upper part of the slide because it's not the idea that impact is first and then process is coming. No, we have to start with both at the beginning and go on to the end. Okay,
Okay.
thank you for
Okay.
this remark.
No, thank you for the answer.
I had another question from here. Yeah, Beniamino, sorry.
No, that's not me. I didn't
Sorry,
raise.
sorry. Ja, oké, ik luister naar u. Ja, okay. No other questions. I understood. Okay, let's go on. Now, talking about measures, there were already some questions. It's an important challenge to have a good understanding of, and maybe to make some choices. When you start making your evaluation plan, you have to make some choices. What do you want to evaluate, and what and how you're going to do that? And therefore, I see really in many projects the need to structure the measures in a good way. And in fact, this shows already the question Jose was asking before. You have CIVITAS measures, but sometimes it's better to cluster them because they really work for the same target group with the same goals. And then it's better in evaluation to take them together and to see it as a whole. But then you have also smaller interactions with other CIVITAS measures and the non-CIVITAS measures, the evolution in the city. And we have to realize that. But in fact, we just discussed this. The other thing is, it's also important when you talk about a measure to understand and to try to structure a bit what's happening in relation to that measure or as part of that measure. And also there, it's sometimes a choice because in some projects, they have, for instance, a measure bicycle lane and another measure awareness campaign. But of course, if this awareness campaign is really working also for this bicycle lane, these two are really coming together. And then it's maybe better to see that as a whole strategy, an integrated measure, where you try to understand in a qualitative way what did, how some activities, some supporting activities, as we call them, really did help in these both aspects I just indicated, both to make the implementation of the measure easier and also to improve the impact. So also that is an important thing to think about when you make your evaluation plan. And a third element in this is also, it's really important to have a good understanding of the whole context of the city or of the region, depending a bit on what is the scale your project is working on in that city. And therefore, we made here a little list of interesting elements. And yeah, it's not the idea to make a large report on that, but at least an evaluation manager and also people who are assessing finally or trying to understand the impact you're measuring and the impact you're explaining at the end of the project should have an idea of the general context, because depending on this context, it's understandable that the impact of the same measure is completely different. In a city where already 30% of the people go by bike to their work, yeah, and a lot of measures will work completely differently as in a city where only 1% is doing that. So it's really important, and therefore it's in bold also, it's at least important to collect, and here in this scheme you see a kind of prioritization of what's really needed, to collect some more general data on a model split on the level of cars, congestion in your city, the level of public transport functioning in your city or in the region you're working on. That's crucial to understand what's really happening with this type of measures. Now, I'm gonna more add some elements concerning the two flows we think it's very important to follow. First, the impact evaluation. Now, as I said, or as I try to indicate, when you have a project, and if we have one measure that's implemented, it's rather easy. But in many situations, you have different measures, and sometimes, as I stressed already, from evaluation point of view, maybe it's important to restructure a bit the measures. And it's sometimes a bit difficult in discussion with the coordinator or the site coordinator. It depends a bit on what's happening in your project. But in any case, if you do that well in the beginning, you will have a much more straightforward evaluation. You will have much easier good findings and coming to better conclusions. And therefore, so you have to choose the good way of indicating the measures, but also it's important to define clearly what is really meant, what is the objective of each measure. And we see many projects that there is a nice proposal, but once the project starts, people have to think again, yeah, what we really want to do. And maybe, and in many cases, I see that it are the evaluation people also who are asking critical questions to understand what is really the objective of the measure. What are maybe the targets? In many proposals, we put targets for one measure or for more measures. And also, what is a very practical output? Now, let's be clear. With output, we mean the immediate result of a measure. For instance, when I say a city is gonna buy new buses, then if they want to buy 10 new buses, that's not the impact of that measure. That's the output. That's the direct result of that measure. When these 10 buses are there, when the bicycle lane is there, maybe when the mobility plan is there, then we come to the main question we have as evaluation people, and that is, what is the impact? And so we have to try to understand already from the beginning, what is the envisaged impacts, what are the envisaged impacts, and what are possible additional, maybe not wanted impacts. That's crucial, because if we don't do this exercise, we are not able to select the best indicators to do that. Now, it's important that for each of these impacts, we try to choose good indicators. Now, in the CIVITAS framework, there is already a list of indicators covering all the different impact categories. However, we believe, and we still have to improve, in fact, all together, because we try to use all material from all projects, and the creativity of people is important. Also, the use of maybe new possibilities of bringing data together. We still can improve this, we can still use new type of indicators. That's one important remark. The other important remark is that some of these indicators are really quantifiable elements. We can count things, we can measure things, but some of these indicators are also more qualitative. And sometimes it's possible to add a kind of scoring system where we say, first, before it's this characteristic is on level 1, and taking into account these and these and these changes and improvements, now it's on level 3. Especially concerning society government, where we talk about the organization of the city. In many cases, it's a qualitative way of assessing. But even then, it's still impact. It's the impact of what we are doing. And therefore, it's important to have a real good thinking on this at the start of our project. Now, on the slides, you just see 2 examples. In the documents, it's a whole list where we tried, as I said, to describe already the different possible indicators. But again, I think it's important that you use as much as possible these indicators as a starting point, especially to use the same names for the same things. That's important for others to understand what we are doing. But further on, we can add new type of indicators and new possibilities. Now, concerning impact evaluation, it's important. Impact, the main thing is there we do before and after analysis. And I think this is obvious for most of you, but it's still important to remember it all the time. We need, of course, a good understanding of the baseline. What was the situation at the moment we started there? And in many cases, it's also important to describe a good business as usual. What would happen after 2 years when we would not implement that measure? Now, in some cases, this business as usual situation is more or less the baseline, because not so much things are happening. And then, of course, we don't have to do the effort. But if there are changes, it's important to describe them, not for the exercise itself, but, and you see that here on the screen, on this graph, the effect or the impact of a measure can be different if we take into account the business as usual or not. And the example I gave with the fool at the beginning of this webinar is one where it's important to describe that business as usual, because this shows that even at the end, we have maybe an impact which looks negative, but in reality, it's really positive. But because if we haven't done, the situation would be much, much worse. And then it's important to have a business as usual situation. Now, choosing indicators is a nice thing, of course, and we can make a lot of theoretical exercises on that. But I would advise not to do that, to be as practical as possible, and not to choose too many indicators, because otherwise it's difficult to measure them, and it's difficult to integrate the findings of them. It's better to choose some important indicators which are more quantitative and to bring them together in a more qualitative way. But an important thing, and that's shown on this slide, is the fact that we have to collect information. We have to collect data. And yeah, we see 2 main strategies: before and after observations. In fact, if possible, that are the most easy one. You just have to subtract figures. We can also do some before and after questionnaires, asking to people what they think, how they behave, and things like that, and make the comparison. But we see also that in many cases, it was not feasible to have a before survey. And in that case, we believe that also what we can give it a name, only after observation can be helpful to understand what's really happening. This could be a questionnaire where you asked users and also maybe non-users of a system, what is their current behavior and what did change in their behavior and why they did change. This is an interesting way of understanding what is the impact of your measure. On the other hand, yeah, we see here more and more the possibility also of using big data to monitoring, for instance, the usage of a system and to collect user opinions. However, especially in relation to the only after observations, we really have to be careful because in many cases, you have the high risk of biased figures. Because if you install a car sharing or a bike sharing system and you ask afterwards only questions to the people who are using this system, of course, you have a very limited view of the impact of your measure. So you have to do some other evaluation. You have to take some other evaluation initiatives to understand the view of also the people who are not using it, and also to understand the share of people who are really using it and elements like that. So that's really an important concern when we try to set up an efficient but also useful evaluation approach. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna stop here for a moment. Are there any further questions or considerations? Okay. Okay, Shanyan here. Shanshan, I give you the floor.
Yes, I just wondering for these indicators, is there some standard method to quantify some the measures so that we could kind of compare across the projects, etc.
In fact, we in the documents we already produced, we have a rather clear definition of these indicators and also some supporting form in which we explain how they can be collected. But there is a large but here. We see that when you have 5 cities where you implement the same measure or something like that, or it's really difficult to make a straightforward comparison by looking to the figures between these cities, because it's difficult to have really the exact same method. That's one thing. And secondly, it's the context, as I already stressed, of the measures are really different. And so I'm a bit careful when they ask me to compare the figures of different cities, because you have to take into account in many cases a lot of qualitative considerations also. So I think sometimes we have to do that, but I'm really a bit careful on making, let's say, schemes and graphs where we say this measure has in this city this percentage of change and in the other one another percentage of change. This type of cross-site evaluation is really a bit dangerous and difficult, and I think it's better that we really put more effort in trying really to understand what's happening in each city and have a good expert and qualitative discussion on this, making a more qualitative comparison between this. Okay, that's my reaction.
Yep, thank you. Yep, thank you.
No. No. Beniamino?
Yes, I have 2 questions. I hope they can be brief. So on the kind of indicators, you know, there are indicators related, for instance, to business, so key performance indicators related to business, indicators, technical indicators, operational indicators, innovation technology indicators. And of course, these should be chained to the data that are used then to measure such indicators. in my opinion, sometimes they are even conflicting with, for instance, indicators related to the quality of life, the people, and so on. For instance, for mobility in towns, some business indicators, even in green stakeholders like charging electrical vehicles, might be even conflicting with other indicators, such as the number of total cars in circulating. But anyway, do you have any hints, any procedure, any guidelines in order to, you know, have a good mix of such indicators to trace and to chain different kind of indicators? So the other question is, how do you value simulations in impact? So when clear indicators or a clear, especially for research project or anyway kind of project we are used to, there are impediments that really cannot make us able to make clear measures. So what about simulations? Do you value them? Until which extent?
Okay. I'll first answer the second question. Indeed, maybe we have to add, because indeed you're right, simulation can really help to make the evaluation better. Now, simulation, I see it on two levels. You have, if you collect data on the before and after situation, and you try to make this data more consistent. For instance, on the traffic you have in your city, or on the number of vehicle kilometers that are driven in the city, then I think a simulation model can help to create a more general view on what's really happening. So indeed, that's really true. On the other hand, sometimes simulation is also used, of course, to do ex-ante evaluations, to understand what's happening before the measure is really implemented. Now, the main idea, it's not our main idea to work like that, of course, because that's not the evaluation what we want. But on the other hand, we see that in many projects, people don't come to the real implementation. And then sometimes it's acceptable that, and it's still valuable also, and it's an interesting source of understanding what these measures are leading to do a kind of ex-ante evaluation using this simulation. So that's a bit how I see the role of evaluation. It can be really helpful to make your evaluation better and more consistent. Concerning your first question, to be honest, it's not completely clear for me. I understand we have a lot of indicators indeed, and I don't see a real conflict between the indicators itself, because yeah, sometimes there is a kind of overlap, of course, and some of the indicators are also we gave it the type of additional indicator because they look to the same thing as or the same impact from a different angle, and of course at that knowing that, it's important not to sum up, let's say, two positive findings concerning two different indicators with an overlap. That's a general concern when you do an evaluation. Multi-criteria evaluation sometimes fails there because they have different elements in their approach, and then we have to avoid these type of overlaps or we have to change our weights, taking into account these overlaps when we try to come to a conclusion. So I think the main criteria in choosing these indicators is in fact the impacts we expect. And I think also an element in this is also we want to have a good coverage of the impact categories. And of course, that's the reason also why we define these 6 categories. And sometimes you know in advance that your measure has not any impact on, let's say, on energy. Okay, then it's not worth to spend effort on it. But on the other hand, yeah, I think we have to do at least the exercise to see what is the impact of what we are doing in these 6 categories, and based on that, choosing the best indicators, taking into account what we want to know and what's feasible to collect. I don't know whether this is a real answer on your question, maybe.
I got a useful answer, but just to clarify with an example what I intend for sometimes a conflict in the choosing of indicators. I mean, typically in a European project, there are many stakeholders and users, towns, of course, scientific people, technical people. So, for instance, for end users, basically business-oriented industries, key indicators are business indicators. So they like to maximize at the end of the day their profit. Yeah. On the other hand, and so they are focused on such, when you are going to collect the indicators coming from the stakeholders and related to the business model, usually they come up with the business-oriented indicators. And of course, you need to measure and you need to improve them. At least in my opinion, they might conflict with other kind of indicators. There are obvious examples like, you know, yeah, I don't go in details.
I see your point now. I see your point now.
On the other hand, operational indicators might be useful to measure if everything is in order, if everything is working, but have nothing to do with the real impact, beneficial impact on citizens or industries and on the other end.
Yeah, I see your point now. I think the little misunderstanding is the fact that I see the indicator as something you can measure. And you link to what you can measure already to the objectives of the stakeholders. And indeed, they have different objectives. They have different goals in what they try to do. And so for one stakeholder, the findings of what you see will be maybe positive. For another stakeholder, it will be negative. And indeed, a transparent evaluation allows to feed this discussion or this appreciation, this appraisal in a good way. I think we worked with different projects recently, and one of the freight projects, the research and innovation projects, and I think it was Novolog, but we are checking the name, had an interesting approach. Yeah, it was Novolog. My colleague Gitte confirms it's Novolog. Had an interesting approach there, where they made an evaluation, but the assessment of the indicators was really linked to weighting factors, which were different for the different stakeholders. And in this way, from evaluation point of view, we can make also this evaluation of the measure more transparent. I think that's really in line what you mean.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, please. Okay. Ah ja, Joe. Ja, Joe. Hij is gestopt. Namir. Ja. Okay, let's go now to process evaluation. I already stressed that on different levels during this webinar. And of course, we already stressed the objectives. I won't repeat it. Understanding what's really happening and also understanding the impact. That is the summary. Now, doing a good process evaluation, I already answered, and I will change that slide, that we have to start at the start of the project doing this. And in fact, to do good process evaluation, it's important to do a pre-analysis of the measures, because it's important to understand who is really working on that measure, which are the responsible stakeholders, and what are their roles, and maybe are there links between these stakeholders, is also an important thing. That's one thing. We also need to understand what is the real target group of our measures or measure, and target group or maybe affected part of the city. Do we want to change the behavior of the commuters? Do we want to change the behavior of one company? We have to be clear on that, because otherwise we won't interpret the results of what we are doing in a good way. And in many cases, but it's not always, it depends really on your measure, it's important and it really helps to make a good identification of supporting activities to approach these target groups, as I showed before. Now, so that's what you should do in the beginning, because based on this, you can already make a kind of process evaluation plan. And process evaluation plan should be a kind of an approach you already can define from the beginning, and you can adopt and optimize during the project, where you choose the activities you will do and how you collect the data. And maybe the basic thing that should be done in any case is that an evaluation person, when he gets and receives the impact measurements and things like that, he should talk at least with the people who are implementing the measure. And if there is somebody who is coordinating everything in the city, could be part of the project or not part of the project, he or she should talk with him or her. That's crucial, because otherwise you will miss elements in understanding the figures. So that's a basic thing. But if the measure is more complex, in the sense that there are more stakeholders involved, there are difficult aspects to understand, it's sometimes interesting to do more. And you can do that already during the project, or you can do that more at the end. And then I won't go in detail of these techniques, but there is material available on this. You can also what we can call learning history sessions, where you have a kind of look back, what did really happening during the implementation of the measure, and maybe during the operational phase, talking to the stakeholders or to part of the stakeholders. You can also organize, or you can have a meeting, as I said, but you can also maybe organize a survey to them. Some projects do that, or just interviewing one or two important stakeholders, just to understand better what really did happen. We can also organize focus group meetings, where we go in detail in some aspects of what we had, what we see at the end of the implementation. And maybe in some cases also a kind of expert validation meeting, where we bring together some experts, local experts or more general experts together, who are discussing what we see as a result of the measure, and in which we try to understand what are the important elements. Maybe if there are little sub-elements working together, we can't distinguish them in the figures we have, but with some expert views, you can rank maybe the importance of the different measures. And so this could and should lead at the end to an important, a good understanding of what we already indicated. What are the barriers for the implementation? What are the drivers for implementation? And of course also what actions were taken to overcome these barriers. That's important also for other cities, learning from what you're doing at that point. And also, if you have identified supporting activities, try to understand how they did work as a support for the implementation of the measure. What was their importance on the impact and on the implementation? And you see this scheme here again. Now, looking to this basic evaluation approach, where we have where we have the impact evaluation and the process evaluation. Looking to this and doing this for some measures or some set of measures, in many cases, it's additionally interesting and important to do what we have called some extended analysis, some further analysis with the material we have already collected. And in many cases, it's important to have a kind of financial analysis. A financial analysis in which we not only look to the impacts of what's happening on the process of implementation, but in which we also try to have a good view on the financial elements of that measure. Because of course, if another city is interested in in your observations, it's important also what is the cost of this. And so a financial analysis just look to the cost, and you can use some accounting techniques, and we have produced also some guidelines concerning that to deal with costs that are spread over many years. So that could be also part of this financial analysis. Additionally, we could also go further and do a social cost benefit analysis or a cost benefit analysis, as there are different names around. And in that case, we try to convert, we try to monetize also some of the impacts we have collected here, we have observed there, into money, and to really come to a real balance of we are doing that, that's the benefit, that's the cost, and is this positive or is this not? This is a challenge of doing that. But of course, for other cities, it's really interesting to have some information of this type, of this kind. And also for this, I have to say, we have produced some, I think, good guidelines now. We haven't produced it ourselves. It are more specialists on this who did that for us. And they're really helpful if somebody wants to do this cost benefit analysis, and we support to do it for some of your important measures. Other actions we can have is maybe upscaling the measures. Upscaling, this means if we have, for instance, a very limited test of one measure, to understand the real impact in your city, sometimes it's important to make a kind of upscaling of this. And there, maybe simulation is helpful, is important. Then you use as much as possible the elements you have observed, but you try to spread that more over the city, over the region, or over a part of it. So that are more extended analysis that really can help you to make your findings, your direct findings of the evaluation better and better understandable. Further, we see that many projects use this, in many cases, interesting observations and findings of evaluation to do additional work. Additional work maybe to produce tools that can be used by cities, tools that can be used also to understand the transferability potentials, and to support and to help also decision makers to make better decisions, using all the information we get from the basic evaluation work. And in fact, this is all important. The main thing what we try to explain is here in this dark blue box, but it's also important to go further depending a bit on the objectives of your project. Doing that, we have one important concern. Of course, we have to be creative and to make an efficient evaluation approach, but let's try to use the same terminology for the same things, the same categorization of impacts, and the same type of characteristics of the implementation project. Of course, doing additional analysis, doing extended analysis, please add what you need to go further. but use the main basic elements in what you're doing. This is crucial to come to a consistent and common understanding what we are all doing. So that's in fact an important message we want to give. Okay, I stop here again for a minute to come to our final messages, let's say. Are there any other concerns, questions we can talk about? Yeah. Beniamino, I give you the floor.
Yes, on this last part, and sorry for my ignorance on CIVITAS, but do they exist such categorizations, terminology, taxonomies that we can efficiently exploit for instance, for our project?
Yeah, we have made a kind of what we call a framework where all these elements are further explained. So if you can have a look at it, maybe that's helpful. We can share that. We will.
We are currently at the beginning, so in the phase of elicitation of indicators, measures, and so on. So this would be really crucial for us to follow this common framework.
And if you have, I wanted to say that at the end, but if you have any further questions, you can contact us. We are open to have a short telco with everybody of you. So we can help. But indeed, it's mainly at the beginning that it's important. Just one example, to use the word impact for impact and to use the word output, output for the direct result of the measure. Don't mix up that, because that's very difficult for other people trying to understand what you're doing. So that's just a small example here. And of course, you don't have to excuse you for not knowing the details of CIVITAS, because we always are interested in fresh views and fresh questions, because otherwise we have the risk of just going on and maybe not in the best way. So please react.
Sorry, another small question. Have you put in place some methodology for elicitation of indicators? Since we are at the beginning, following even a methodology you might have devised would be very, very useful.
Sorry, you said a methodology for selection of indicators?
Yes, selection, elicitation, so coming up from the different stakeholders and following any methodology for us to select the indicators, right?
Beniamino, I come back a bit to what I answered before. I think, yeah, there is one good method to work here, trying to understand the measures, look to the different categories, and try to select the best indicators, but taking into account also the indicators. Mainly, you can start from the list we have produced. That is a much longer list than in this presentation. And but of course, taking into account what's feasible and what is really the most characterizing the impacts you are expecting.
Sorry, I explained bad. I mean, in a collaborative project, there are very many different stakeholders, and so selecting indicators is a process in itself, with so many people, stakeholders, and so on. So have you devised a way how we could, proceed in dealing with all the stakeholders, explaining them, of course, CIVITAS, disseminating CIVITAS would be good, but, driving this collaborative and collective selection process, elicitation process.
What I would do then is making yourself a first basic list of what you think is important, taking into account mainly the objectives of the measures and your project, and providing this information to the different stakeholders and saying, this is what we think, but taking into account your concerns, and you can also go further and suggest some other measures, indicators, sorry, and maybe you could provide them also the full list which is available, but allowing them also to propose others. Maybe this is a good way to have an interactive discussion with them and to come to a kind of conclusion. I should allow, in any case, that it depends a bit on your project, of course, but I don't believe that if you have a specific project with implementation in different cities, that every city should use exactly the same approach. Depending on the context, sometimes that you should be flexible and to allow some local flexibility, some elements which are really linked to the local situation, because you have to cover that too. Okay, that's more or less what I can add. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Now, coming to an end, in fact, we talked about impact evaluation, we talked about process evaluation, and we talked about extended and additional analysis we can do to make the understanding of what you're doing better, and also, yeah, to give just a very important contribution on the field you're working in, and to the people you're supporting as evaluation people. Now, in CIVITAS, we try to bring the different elements we are collecting in this way together. But this is not a kind of obligatory scheme I have here, but it shows only that we try to make up what we call measure evaluation result sheets. This is a kind of report we want to have at the end of the project, and also and this report explains how you did evaluate things, how what data you collected, what activities you did, and what are your main findings. And in fact, this could be a report that is really built up during your project. But during your project, you have also to do some efforts to understand the process, and that's what meant here. And some projects, it really depends for project to project, and also depending on the lifetime of project, you try to understand the process and do some feedback loops where you say, yeah, we try to understand the process, we see barriers and drivers, and maybe we make some corrections already to the measure. So that's the other thing that's happening. But an important third level is that in many cases, you try to understand also on a more general level what's happening in the city, taking into account 1, 2, or 3 measures you have there. You try to do some activities to understand what's happening in the different working fields you defined. And I indicated here work package level, but this can mean a lot, depends. Some projects have, for instance, 3 or 4 work packages who are really clustering the type of measures, working one work package on behavioral change, the other on freight and things like that. So we try, or these projects try to understand what's happening during that implementation for this type of measures. And yeah, the same happens a bit on project level. If the main objective of your project is to change the behavior in, let's say, port cities, then it's important to stress and to have a further attention and specific attention on what measures can contribute to port-related mobility problems. And what this scheme expresses a bit, it's important to do these activities and to plan these activities during the lifetime of your project. But it's also, and this can lead to conclusions on city level, work package level, and project level. But it's also important to give a kind of feedback where these type of conclusions are also linked again to the specific measures. Because if people after your projects are reading the measure evaluation result sheets because they are interested in an important and in a specific measure, it's interesting that they also have access to the more general considerations you make on these levels. This makes these measure evaluation result sheets much more interesting than just looking to the measure itself in that city. Okay, now again, there is no strong obligation to make such a measure evaluation result sheets, although both the EA related projects and REAL related projects, and we understood that you are mainly now EA projects, although they are not of the completely same nature as the demonstration projects, Portis, Eccentric, and destinations. Yeah, at a certain moment, you will receive from us a kind of survey. And this survey is this measure evaluation result sheet, where we hope that you can report on the different aspects of the measure. And therefore, it's already important to take into consideration more or less this scheme, but you can optimize it for yourself, you can simplify it, but this will allow you to fill in at a certain moment this survey in the best way. And it's our idea that we have to work on this together with you the next 2 years. This makes it much more easier for you to provide the information. This will save time for you, and this makes for us the understanding of what you're doing much better. Okay, so that's I wanted to add. Now, just also for your information, we produced already, and it's 3, I think, important ways of reporting. And the first one is what I just explained. That's the measure reporting on evaluation reports and evaluation findings. In that document, yeah, I already stressed it. We talk about what is the objectives, what are the outputs, what is the impact, the process, the finding, lessons learned. And that's set up as a kind of survey, but it is in fact a template you can use to report. So that's one thing. Then we have an additional document, and you can use that or you don't use that, but at least you have to find a way to report on the process of implementation, the process evaluation. And we produce a document which is well structured and in which we have a lot of examples, let's say, or categories of drivers and barriers. And in fact, even if you don't use that document as a way of reporting on evaluation, on the process evaluation, you can still use that document to inspire you and to find elements you can use in your process evaluation report. And then the last thing, we already also developed a planning and monitoring tool. And it depends a bit on the complexity of your project, whether it's useful to use. But we see that in the current demonstration project, beside the evaluation people, also the management of the project are starting to use it. Because it's a rather simple Excel tool in which we make the link between the implementation itself, the stages of implementation, as you see here on the slide, the data collection activities, and the reporting. But because it's really crucial for you, if you work with cities and sites where things are implemented, to keep in a good way track of the implementation progress, the moment you can do some data collection activities and the moment you can report on that. And that's a bit the simple and easy purpose of this planning and monitoring tool. So also this we can make available to you. Okay, This was more or less what we wanted to discuss again. As we know, some of these elements we explained already to some of you. And again, we are open to discuss further all elements. Now, maybe we still have a short time for some further questions or concerns on the last part, maybe, or also in general. Oh, yeah. Okay, Ju, I open your speaking channel.
Yeah, hi Dirk, this is Joe here. Just a kind of simple question really. All of these tools and the definitions of indicators and so on that you've spoken of, is there a kind of one place we can go to get all of these, or what's the procedure to, you know, to get access to all of these resources that you've
all
described?
these things are available on this CIVITAS satellite exchange hub. And yeah, it's a way of we're gonna send that to you again. And yeah, let's be honest, it's also a way to support you to use that that platform. But there we have brought everything together, the latest version, and that's the best way to have access to it. Okay.
Because it strikes me that a good thing to do, at least in our project, would be for some of us in the project to go in there and look at the thing in detail, and then if there are questions we have on specifics, to contact you or someone else about that. But I do feel the need to look now. I think you've given us a good overview of all these things, but I do feel the need now to look in detail at these things to really get some concrete things and see how it can apply to a project.
Joe, that's the role we want to play. We want to coach people. We want to be a kind of interaction platform. And because sometimes it's not because you don't know things, but you want to have a kind of second reflection on this before you make the decision how you're going to handle this. So that's an invitation to all of you that please use the information we make available, but also are not afraid to ask any question on this, to ask some opinion of us. The little benefit we have is not that we have maybe more knowledge than you. That's not the case, but we have more information because we saw other projects working on what you're doing, and we try to share good practices and elements like that. And that's the role we want to play for you. And in this, I think that's for the benefit for all of us to make a good, transparent and consistent evaluation approach, which is feasible to do. That's an important goal I think we all have.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I try to find Steve. Steve? Hello, Steve.
Hi, Dirk. Yeah, that was a really clear presentation. I've got a question about when after data should be collected. You mentioned at the start there are different types of measures. So you've got new infrastructure, new services, new ways of governing or organizing the way that things are done, and also activities to change awareness. I just wondered, for those different types of measures, they can take longer to generate the impacts related to the outcomes. So do you have any advice or guidance on how long different types of measures should be operating before the after data is collected?
I think I get more and more a reasonable idea on this, but it's and you gave indeed the basic element in the answer. You gave it yourself already, in the sense that we have to consider when the impact of that measure reaches a reasonable level. some of the measures, yeah, the impact will go on for 2 years after the project, and we can't measure that, so we have to make choices. In many cases, I think that 6 months is a good starting point when we're a good starting point when we take how long does it take to have an impact. Although of course it depends on, is it really a change of the way people drive their car to the city? If you change the traffic situation after 3 weeks, yeah, we see a kind of stabilizing of the situation on their routing. But then you have the other impact of changing their behavior, and maybe that and taking maybe another mode, and that takes much longer because people have to do a kind of thinking about that. So I think it's not really linked. There are elements on this linking to the type of measure, but it's also linked to the type of impact. And yeah, and maybe we can take in this question into account as a kind of suggestion also. Maybe we can try to collect some good experience on this and giving some guidance in the documents we will produce shortly on this. Yeah. But again, it will depend on different factors, both the type of measure and the type of impact.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, that's what I can say for the moment. And if we don't have to wait to the production of a next document. If working on this, we collect some information already on this, I can already send it to you, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dirk.
Thanks, Steve. Okay. Okay. Then I think we come to an end. Thank you a lot for your interest. Thank you a lot for the questions, because these questions are important to steer also our attention and the way we develop some elements. And yeah, I can only stress the mission I just explained. We all have together coming to good evaluation plans, coming to good approaches, and to come to good findings in a structured, understandable, and structured way. And yeah, let's work together on this the next 2 years. And I wish you a lot of success in starting up your projects, because some people think that evaluation comes at the end. Yeah, we all know that it really starts in the beginning and maybe before. Okay, thank you a lot, and I hope to see you and to hear you in next occasions. Also, for Gitte, my colleague here next to me, we wish you the best. Thank you.